Hi geographers, welcome to this lesson about earthquakes. In this lesson we're going to be exploring the characteristics of an earthquake, and then I'm going to set you up with some work to do looking at two case studies of earthquakes, examining the impacts and the responses to those events. I want us to start by considering the features of an earthquake. If you turn to page 7 in your booklets, you've got a copy of this diagram, and I'd like us just to have a little look at the main features of an earthquake. There's in particular 3 phrases that I want us to be familiar with. That's the focus, the epicenter, and seismic waves. The focus, which you can see down here, indicated by this red dot, we can define that as being the point where the earthquake originates. This is located within the crust, and it's where the energy of the earthquake is released from. You'll also notice directly above the focus on the surface is a point marked the epicenter. So this is the point on the surface which is directly above the focus. Now, very often when you hear about earthquakes being reported in the news, they talk about the location of the epicenter, and that's because it's a point on the Earth's surface that we could relate to in terms of how far away it is from a particular town or city. So the energy is released from the focus, and the epicenter is an imaginary point directly above that focus on the surface of the Earth. The seismic waves are the circles that you can see here, rippling out in all directions from the focus and the epicenter. Okay, the seismic waves are carrying the energy released by the earthquake. So let's add a definition of those into our booklets as well. So seismic waves, we can define those as being waves transferring the energy released by the earthquake. Because ultimately that's what an earthquake is. It's a release of energy within the Earth's crust. That energy has been built up over time by the stresses and strains at a plate boundary, and then that energy gets released suddenly, and it gets released in the form of these seismic waves, and they travel in all directions, and that's what causes the ground to shake. Now, when an earthquake happens, there can be some either primary or secondary effects of that earthquake, and it's important that we're aware of the difference between primary and secondary effects. So primary effects, these are caused directly by the earthquake. So basically they result from the shaking of the ground. Some examples of the primary effects of earthquakes would be maybe people being killed, collapsing buildings, damage to roads, all of those things can be caused as a direct result of the earthquake. Secondary effects, on the other hand, they are the indirect effects of earthquakes. And usually they are what we might call the knock-on effects of a primary effect. So a primary effect, like the ground shaking or people dying or collapsing buildings, might trigger then another secondary impact. Some examples which will relate to some of the case studies we're going to have a look at, things like avalanches, landslides, tsunami, and also fires as well, because the primary effect might damage some roads and some gas pipes underneath those roads, and then a secondary impact could be that that gas then catches fire and the fire can then cause damage to buildings. The two examples of earthquakes that we're going to have a look at are in two contrasting areas of the world. We're going to look at two earthquakes, one in Nepal in 2015 and one in Chile in 2010. Now, if we have a look at the two boxes in your booklets, we can see that we've got some initial kind of background information about those two earthquakes. So in Nepal, it happened on the 25th of April 2015, and it was a magnitude 7.9. That indicates the strength or size of the earthquake. And bearing in mind that a 9 point something is probably about the largest earthquake we would ever experience on the planet, we can see it's a relatively large earthquake. Okay, it was also quite shallow, and it caused, because it hit the mountainous region of the Himalayas, it caused lots of landslides and avalanches, which, as we'll see, went on to have some other significant impacts. There's also another earthquake we're going to have a look at, which was in Chile on the 27th of February 2010, and that was an 8.8. Okay, so it's actually a step higher in terms of its magnitude. Okay, now one thing to remember about the magnitude of an earthquake is that when you go up one step, so from a 7 to an 8, for example, or in this case a 7.9 to an 8.8 is almost one step on that scale, you're actually increasing the amount of energy released by that earthquake by 32 times. So the earthquake in Chile was actually 32 times more powerful than the earthquake in Nepal. That's because of the way that the scale is used to measure earthquakes. When you go up one step, you're actually increasing the amount of energy by 32 times. So this was a much larger earthquake. That also then went on to trigger a large tsunami, which affected some of the coastal regions of Chile. Before we move on to actually look at what happened in those earthquakes, what I want to do is show you some background about the level of development in those two countries. So if you have a look on this slide here, we can see some development indicators for Nepal, for Chile, and also I've put the UK's information in there for a means of comparison. If we look firstly at the GNI per capita, which, if you remember back to our topic about development, this is a measurement of the amount of money that a country earns in a year divided by the number of people in that country. We can see that in Nepal, it's $1,090. In Chile, it's $15,000. So it's 15 times larger. On average, a person in Chile has 15 times more money, more income than a person in Nepal. And in the UK, we can see it's $42,370. This also then links a little bit if we look at the Human Development Index. Again, if you remember back to our topic about development, the Human Development Index is a combination of income, of life expectancy, and of numbers of years in school. And it uses quite a complex calculation to basically come up with a number between 0 and 1. And the closer to 1, the more developed the country is, and the closer to 0, the less developed the country is. So again, we can see how these countries compare. 0.6 in Nepal, 0.85 in Chile, and 0.93 in the UK. Remember, 1 would be perfect. There's no country that has one. Some countries get quite close. And I've also put the rankings in brackets as well. So the UK is ranked 13th out of all the countries in the world. Chile is ranked 43rd, and Nepal is ranked 142nd. So it's a very, very significantly less developed nation than Chile or the UK. Another thing to look at as well, which could be relevant in the context of hazards, is the physician density, or the number of doctors there are per 1,000 people. And again, we can see how those numbers differ. So it's less than 1 per 1,000 in Nepal, and it's 2.4 per 1,000 in Chile, and almost 2.8 per 1,000 in the UK. So on average, in Chile and in the UK, we've got at least twice the number of doctors per person. And that would obviously have impacts when we think about how easily hospitals in Nepal would be able to treat people following an earthquake. The key thing to remember about these two countries, Nepal and Chile, is that overall, looking at these development indicators, we can confidently say that Chile is a low-income country. Okay, it's one of the poorest nations on the planet. Chile, on the other hand, although it's not quite as developed as the UK, the GNI per capita isn't quite as high and the Human Development Index isn't quite as high, Chile is still classified as a high income country. And what we're going to do now is examine the impacts and responses in those earthquakes. And in the back of our minds, we want to be considering how those impacts and responses vary between countries. So turning back to your booklets then, you'll notice that on the following pages, page 8 and 9, you've got some space to record some of the impacts and responses for the earthquake in Chile, and some space to record the impacts and responses for the earthquake in Nepal. To help you with this task, you're going to need to look at the textbook which has been uploaded to Teams. So you can see a copy of those textbook pages on the screen now. What you want to do is scroll down until you get to page 14 and 15 in the textbook. Page 14 has some background information which we've already been through. Page 15 has some impacts for both the Nepal earthquake and for the earthquake in Chile as well. And then the next page, page 16, has some information about the responses both in Chile and in Nepal as well, and it separates those out into immediate and long-term responses. So use those pages in the textbook to help you complete that grid in your booklet.